work.
It's not really an environment where there's much work to look for.
And risky business. Sex workers, adult shops and gun stores denied services by a banking industry taking the moral high ground.
Yeah, it's very frustrating and crippling because we're trying to run a business, a legitimate business.
Also on the program, one of Australia's biggest insurance companies taken to court, accused of failing to deliver $60 million worth of promised discounts. But first, New South Wales will open its borders to fully vaccinated international arrivals from November, without the need for any quarantine. The New South Wales Premier declared the state won't discriminate between returning Australians and overseas tourists. Travellers coming into Sydney will need to show proof they've had a TGA-approved vaccine and be tested for COVID-19 before they board their flight. Last month, New South Wales introduced a 7-day home quarantine trial. That will now end in a matter of weeks. All other states remain closed to travellers from New South Wales. Premier Dominic Perrottet says people from his state will be travelling to Bali before Broome when the reforms come into effect.
New South Wales says we welcome home every Australian overseas, or we want tourism back. We want people back into work and get our economy moving, and that's what today's announcement is all about.
But don't expect tourists to start flooding back straight away. The Prime Minister did welcome the move by New South Wales, confirming the cap on the number of Australians returning to the state will be lifted, but said the federal government will not be opening up borders to tourists or other visa holders just yet.
This is about Australian residents and citizens first. The Commonwealth Government has made no decision to allow other visa holders, skilled visa holders, student visa holders, international visitors travelling under an ETA or other international visa arrangement, visiting visa arrangement, to come into Australia under these arrangements. They are decisions for the Commonwealth Government, as the Premier and I know.
Quarantine requirements and travel restrictions have been the unanswered questions facing international tourism operators about when the Australian market will become viable again. Leanne Harwood is the local head of the Intercontinental Hotel Group and president of the Accommodation Association. She says the end of quarantine in New South Wales is a game changer.
The opening up of the borders internationally is just enabling us to welcome people back into our industry that's been absolutely devastated for the last 18 months. So it is, without doubt, a welcome news.
This obviously hinges, though, on the federal government reopening the borders to international tourists, which is still up in the air. Is this something the industry has been discussing with the government?
It is. As you can imagine, Stephanie, we've been working very, very closely with both the state and the federal governments to have plans in place to open the borders back up again, both to welcome Australians back and ensure that we create a safe environment for them to return, but also how can we get international tourism back into Australia, which will be critical for the success of our industry to return back to full occupancies.
And this is a conversation that's obviously been going on for a long time now, and, you know, international flights to Australia, that's not something international airlines can just turn back on straight away, and they have warned they won't be able to make plans to ramp up their operations here without further clarity. Is this a worry for a business like Intercontinental?
It is a worry, Stephanie, and I've got a live example where I've got a staff member who's located in New Zealand, and we've been trying to get him back into Australia, and he's been sitting there this afternoon after the recent news, literally refreshing the airline sites every 3 minutes to try and get flights back. So we know it's going to be a bumpy ride for the next few weeks, probably few months actually, as we return or try to return to normal.
And once we do start getting tourists into New South Wales, Intercontinental obviously operates nationally. Do you see other states following this lead, or could we start to see a two-speed tourism recovery?
We hope we don't see a two-speed tourism recovery, and that would be the worst thing possible for our industry. What's critical for us is to have stability across both national and international borders. We really need to work together to make sure that we get the national and domestic tourism back up and running first and foremost, followed very, very closely by the international tourism.
And with the end of hotel quarantine and now not even home quarantine in New South Wales, the hotel quarantine was obviously a small lifeline for the industry through the pandemic. What's the feeling around the end of that from that perspective?
Look, we've been extremely proud of the fact that our team members in our hotels, who quite frankly are heroes, have stepped up to support the quarantine initiative, and they've done everything that they can to keep our communities safe. So quite frankly, for us now to transition from this current state of quarantine facilities in our hotels into a normal operating environment, we're delighted and excited. Our challenge is going to be is how we ensure that our hotels that have been utilised for those quarantine facilities for 18 months in some circumstances are given the opportunity to get back to the state that they were in pre-COVID. So we need to have some support for these hotels to have an investment and get them back to where they were pre-COVID.
And one element of that, of course, is the staffing. And in hospitality, we seem to be seeing a shift from not enough work to not enough workers. What are operators doing to address this?
Gosh, and there is no doubt it's the biggest crisis of talent that we've ever seen in the history of our industry. We are absolutely desperate to welcome workers back to our industry. And right now, our association is going out with full campaigns to encourage people to come and work with us. And we're looking at flexible work environments, and we're creating an atmosphere and an environment for team members to come and join our industry.
And visa holders are obviously a significant part of the industry workforce as well. Until they start returning in significant numbers, do things like higher wages need to be considered, or, more secure conditions, which are often criticisms levelled at hospitality?
There's no doubt we are challenged by not having the international visa holders in here and the students. And again, critical for us to get back to where we were from a staffing level is to get and welcome those students back into our industry. And we're looking at all ways that we can to create a safe and secure and good quality environment for our future people to come and join us. So we're reviewing every opportunity we can to welcome people back into our industry.
Australia's unemployment rate has risen for the first time in almost a year. Nearly 140,000 jobs were lost last month, mostly in Victoria. But the jobless rate rose only slightly because thousands of people gave up looking for work during lockdowns. As New South Wales reopens, some businesses are now struggling to find workers. Amanda Lunaday is looking forward to being back in the salon after weeks of no work.
It's been a very weird feeling to not be around and socialising and, being with my team who I've been with for 12 years.
She's relying on the COVID disaster payment as she waits for Melbourne's reopening.
I'm now finding that it's getting more of a struggle because $7.50 was not a wage that I had sustained before.
Typically, to get government support when you're out of work, you need to be actively job hunting, but that requirement has been suspended during lockdown.
It's not really an environment where there's much work to look for. So those people, they're counted as not being in the labour force rather than being unemployed. The workforce has actually shed around about 333,000 people since the lockdowns began, since 3 months ago. So a really big move in the size of the labour force.
That saw the participation rate hit a 15-month low. As a result, the unemployment rate increased only slightly in September to 4.6%. That's despite 138,000 job losses, with large falls in employment in Victoria and the ACT, and a more modest decline in New South Wales. Hours worked across the country increased after 3 months of falls.
Some of it, I think, reflects what's been happening in Queensland. And hours worked rose by much more than that, over 5%, which is a really big bounce.
And in New South Wales, construction got back underway and businesses adjusted to COVID testing and vaccination requirements.
Since New South Wales has reached the 70% double-dose vaccination rates, more than 500,000 people have come off the COVID disaster payment. When you open up your economy, people get back to work.
Sydney's reopening, and so too are hospitality venues like this one, which means hiring activity is on the rise. Hamish Watts is looking for more staff for his bars and restaurants.
We placed ads this time last year for some casual staff, and we got about 800 applicants last year. This year we're getting just under 100.
This pub is able to return to full trading hours because it kept most of its existing workforce.
Our strategy throughout the lockdown was to really focus on retention, but the scary part is how it's going to translate when things ramp up, particularly after Melbourne Cup and on the lead up to Christmas.
Hospitality recruiter Luke Butler is seeing shortages from casuals right up to management roles.
It's being felt very widely right across the country now.
Visa holders leaving Australia and a lack of new migrants has reduced the talent pool, but local workers are also leaving the sector.
Anecdotally, we would estimate that around 30% of the people that we would have spoken to who are career professionals within hospitality have decided to look at other industries.
Economists say the unemployment rate could still rise in coming months.
As we go through this period where people re-enter the labour market, looking for work, but they don't find it straight away.
In Melbourne, Amanda Lunaday is hoping to pick back up where she left off.
We are actually going to start calling our clients and rebooking those people.
Booking in a return to work. A $4 billion federal government program to boost jobs hasn't been much of a success. JobMaker was a key announcement in the 2020 budget. It was meant to generate 450,000 jobs, but new documents obtained under Freedom of Information laws show it's created just 1% of that. Daniel Ziffer reports.
Stuck in our first recession in 3 decades, the government touted the scheme JobMaker as one of the tickets out.
Treasury estimates that this will support around 450,000 jobs for young people.
Employers would be paid between $100 to $200 a week to create jobs for people under the age of 35. But previously secret documents from Treasury show just 5,278 roles were created. And the count of individuals may include an employee more than once, where they changed the employer. More than 4,000 companies processed a claim. But that number includes forms that may be subject to a payment suppression, including eligibility checks.
It wasn't designed well. It was narrowly targeted, and that was against academic advice.
The Treasurer said, with a stronger than expected economic recovery, an estimates variation was made in the last budget, with Treasury estimating the hiring credit payments to total $93 million.
Unemployment is at its lowest level in a decade. But that's not giving us a true picture, because so many people have withdrawn from the workforce.
So there's more work to be done to get the balance right.
The federal government is scaling back COVID disaster payments, which have provided a lifeline for stood-down workers. More than $10 billion has been paid, mostly to people in New South Wales. The Treasurer Josh Frydenberg says the move will encourage workers to apply for jobs and alleviate staff shortages. But economists are concerned some sectors won't bounce back as quickly. Here's Daniel Ziffer again.
Hamish would normally have 5 shifts a week working on Sydney Harbour. Instead, he's got 2 all month. He's one of 2.2 million Australians who've been supported by COVID-19 disaster payments.
I wouldn't have been able to sustain myself without them.
The payments, of up to $750 a week, are ending as states and territories hit 70% and 80% vaccination rates. Concerns remain.
You need to have ongoing stimulus, ongoing support, public supports that go directly to individuals as well as businesses in order to support them.
You know, a cinema's not going to employ every projectionist for a cinema that's only running one cinema.
In Victoria, Mark Respy longs to be back working at this cinema.
Well, we get to see lots of movies and make coffees and cocktails and talk to all the customers and to sell tickets.
But it won't be allowed to have packed houses.
Every time we open, it takes a while to get back to that normal kind of running.
Some of Australia's top economists think it high risk to tie the removal of payments to vaccination targets rather than to actual economic conditions. Others see a transition wobble ahead, but are reassured by high levels of household savings. And some say it will disproportionately affect young and lower income workers in sectors that can't snap back due to ongoing restrictions. Mark says only the decision makers think the disaster is over.
They have security in their jobs. They know that their income isn't going to be cut because things are reopening slowly, and they don't seem to realise that other people rely on these payments at the moment.
Disaster payments have cost $10.5 billion, $7 billion of that in New South Wales. The support disappears a fortnight after the 80% vaccination target is reached.
The corporate watchdog is taking the parent company of NRMA Insurance to court, alleging it failed to pass on discounts to nearly 600,000 customers. ASIC claims the policyholders were promised deals when they renewed their car and home insurance, but the discounts allegedly weren't passed on, resulting in a $60 million loss to customers.
This is widespread conduct that we are alleging, and the number of contraventions is extensive.
NRMA's parent company, IAG, has apologised and says it's already paid back $100 million to affected customers. The case will be heard in the federal court next year. To markets, and Australian stocks managed another weekly gain after a good session on Friday. The ASX 200 added 0.6% over the trading week, while the All Ordinaries gained 0.75%. Kyle Rodder from IG says there wasn't one clear catalyst for the positivity.
We have seen equities across the world rebound over the last couple of sessions, but I mean, if you look overnight, we did have a really strong Wall Street lead, positive results from some of the big banks in the United States. We had some producer price index data that showed price growth last month a little bit weaker than expected and alleviated some of those concerns about inflation. And we actually saw US jobless claims numbers released for the week, and it was their lowest weekly number since the start of the pandemic. So that seemed to really shift the narrative into sort of, I suppose, a fairly positive, bullish one. It definitely doesn't seem yet that those overarching concerns about growth, inflation, monetary policy tightening and all those things are gone yet. But at least just here and now, we've got markets willing to take on a little bit more risk. And you could argue that maybe some of that bad news has been baked in now.
And some nice moves for travel stocks locally as well, at least. But in the US, we had some better than expected earnings from the biggest banks. What are their views on how the recovery is tracking over there?
Well, they're actually really upbeat, and it probably stood in contrast to what the results actually showed. They did show some really solid results still in their investment banking departments for the most part, and their financial markets, so their trading desks more or less, continue to generate some reasonably strong revenue, although not quite as strong as it has been in the past when we saw some of the manic behaviour in markets at the start of the year. But even though we did see some mixed results, as well as sort of, I suppose, slightly dour forecasts for credit growth going forward, some of the management of these big banks were really upbeat on the outlook, and on the outlook in particular for the US consumers.
We do, of course, though, have some inflation concerns building globally, given we have the energy crisis going on, power prices rising due to supply shortages in Asia and Europe. How's that playing out at the moment?
Well, we've seen a little less nervousness in the market this week because the upward momentum in energy prices has subsided a little bit. It's really centering around natural gas in particular, and mostly in Europe, to a lesser extent China and Asia. But we have seen prices still inching higher a little bit, but certainly not seeing the sort of eye-watering rises that we were experiencing the last couple of weeks, again, when prices were sort of discounting that crunch across the globe. It's a bit of a live issue, and it's still one that I think is a reason why this kind of rebound in sentiment in the last couple of days, should be seen with a little bit of skepticism, not complete doubt, with a little bit of skepticism, because these supply-side issues more broadly, as well as the energy shock that we are currently experiencing, still hasn't resolved itself. It's highly structural, in nature, not easy to address with immediate policy fixes. And there are still indications that these persistently higher energy prices could be with us for some time, which of course, is a major drag on global growth, industrial activity, for example, as well as putting upward pressure on prices and maybe forcing central bankers to tighten policy sooner than previously thought. So the markets have put that concern on the back burner the last couple of days, but prices still remain elevated, and those concerns about higher inflation and the impact of higher energy prices are certainly persisting.
Sex workers, adult shops and even gun stores are being denied services by Australian banks and global payment processors. Financial institutions see these industries as too high a risk to do business with. But the former Small Business Ombudsman, Kate Carnell, says they shouldn't be allowed to discriminate against legally operating firms or sole traders. Here's Rihanna Whitson.
When Simon Mawson and his partner Monique Termine took over a successful sex shop in 2018, they were shocked that they were denied banking and payment services from the major banks.
The ANZ, the lady who we were dealing with, actually said, it's most likely because of the industry that you're trying to finance.
Instead, they had to sign up with a minor financial institution that doesn't have branches or ATMs. They're not alone. Banking discrimination against certain businesses is widespread.
It's really frustrating. Our industry is a completely different place to what it was 50 years ago. There's a huge focus on health and wellbeing. There's a huge focus on education.
NAB is the only big bank that's upfront about denying services to specific industries. It doesn't deal with brothels, but does have some sex workers as customers. Others, like the Commonwealth Bank, say they assess applications on a case-by-case basis.
Banks are pushing a range of these businesses underground. They're pushing them into a cash-only type economy, which isn't what we want at all. We want everyone paying appropriate tax, operating in the legal system.
Sex workers have told the ABC most people in their industry have struggled to get banking services.
Having accounts closed, having funds either frozen or actually seized, and being kicked off of financial services.
The industry's also been denied access to global payment processors like PayPal and MasterCard.
Where you don't actually have an option to process payments, you actually can't work.
The big banks have been far from good corporate citizens themselves. In recent years, they've been fined for failing to stop their services being used for child exploitation and money laundering. The body that represents them, the Australian Banking Association, declined to be interviewed, but said its members are obligated under legislation to identify and mitigate against a variety of risks.
And I think most Australians would think the last people that we'd make our moral arbiter would be the banking industry.
The former Small Business Ombudsman says the right to banking should be enshrined in law. That would also help gun shops. Most store owners won't speak out for fear of losing access to banking services. Gary Giorgio has signed up with a major financial institution, but says he's treated as a high-risk business.
Quite a few other of the gun shops are having problems with getting FPOS terminals and merchant facilities with any bank.
Mr Giorgio's business also can't use Afterpay, and smaller banks have rejected his loan applications. Afterpay says it does do business with some adult shops, but won't provide services to firearms businesses or sex workers.
It's very frustrating and crippling because we're trying to run a business, a legitimate business.
A legitimate business that is too high risk for most banks.
The Australian healthcare sector's reliance on single-use plastic has soared during the pandemic. It's being used in everything from plastic gowns to face shields, even the syringes to deliver COVID vaccines. But some healthcare workers are trying to reduce the waste, and there's a business case for doing it too, as Amelia Terzon reports.
Tens of thousands of COVID vaccines are being administered daily.
Put your finger on that.
Each syringe is only used once and comes with a hoard of disposable, single-use plastic. At this vaccination hub, some of it is being collected. The local health body's sustainability officer is keen to clamp down on waste.
70 kilos of those we've captured in 4 weeks.
Out the back, it's piling up.
Obviously, COVID's had a big impact in terms of our actual medical waste. And, you know, our hospitals have seen a high increase of what we've been producing, which is why we've kind of jumped on board to start recycling out of our vaccination centre.
Okay, let's go.
Rodrigo Fritas Lamora is also involved in the syringe recycling program at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney.
It's widely known that our waste volumes are a lot. There's a lot of things we cannot reuse.
He's dismayed at all of the waste during the pandemic.
We've seen a 3- or 4-fold increase in waste, and that's due to multiple factors. It's a lot of PPE, a lot of single-use items.
This footage from a nurse on a COVID ward shows how much waste she's generating in just a few hours. It all ends up in bins like these.
These yellow bins are chock-a-block full of single-use masks, single-use gowns, all of the sorts of equipment we've been using so much more to deal with this pandemic. This hospital alone has seen a 40% rise in this sort of waste.
Each gown or each N95 mask, for example, that we're wearing at the moment is not particularly expensive, but it adds up very quickly when we start thinking even if it's only a few dollars per item.
The hospital is also passionate about reusing some items.
And found that it actually overall saves about $100,000 a year.
The COVID vaccine plastic bits are being sent to this factory. It's turning the medical waste into parts for roller doors and even wind turbines.
One pilot program obviously has cost the company a lot of money, but it's to prove a point and to prove that this circular economy can be achieved.
The body leading the pilot program agrees.
We worked out that with recycling 40 to 60% of clinical plastics, we could generate savings equivalent to hiring 40 new nurses.
While syringe caps are just the literal tip of the problem, healthcare workers are embracing the opportunity.
Taking that time out of their busy days just to do this additional step is great, so I applaud them.
Tackling 2 problems at once.
And that's all from Close of Business. I'm Stephanie Chalmers. Thanks for watching.